Hello and welcome back to part 2 of module 5, where we are going to continue to study cross-cultural negotiation. Remember, as marketers, we want to adapt our style to blend in better with other cultures, but we also want to understand the differences we encounter in other countries. This module is going to be quite theoretical, but please try to concentrate and perhaps even repeat this video more than once, because it certainly will help you one day. We're going to discuss the cultural dimensions, which was developed by a renowned researcher, Dr. Hoffstede. And then our objectives would be firstly to introduce the cultural dimensions, and secondly to discuss practical advice on dealing with each of these dimensions. So let's look at the 5 cultural dimensions. First, we have power distance. A power distance index will typically measure the extent to which those who have less power will accept that power is distributed unevenly. And it's perceived that low power distance entities are more democratic and consultative. Next, we'll have individualism, which is the extent to which individuals are integrated into groups. And next we have masculinity. This deals with the division of roles between male and female genders. And our next dimension is uncertainty avoidance. This can be classed as a society's tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity. And then our final dimension is called long-term orientation. This proposes that some societies are long-term orientated in their dealings and others are more short-term orientated. A country where power distance is high will typically have the following characteristics. We can expect to see centralized companies, very strong hierarchies. We can also expect to see large gaps in compensation. In other words, top management will be paid a lot more than people lower down the line. And there'll be gaps in authority and even gaps in respect. Now, when we're dealing with a country where there's high power distance, here's a few useful tips to implement. Try to always acknowledge the leader's power because it really matters to them. Be aware that you may need to go to the top, in other words, to the leader or senior management for answers, because very often people lower down the line will be less informed and simply unable to help you. It's also not recommended to voice your disapproval of anything in that company to people lower down the line. Now, let's have a look at a country where power distance is low. In this case, the characteristics we can expect to find is that the organization will be flatter. Now, what do we mean by flatter? By this we mean the information and power is much more equally distributed. We can also expect to find that supervisors and employees are considered almost as equal. There's very little difference between people higher up and lower down the line. Now, when dealing with a low power distance country, here are a few useful tips. Always try to use teamwork, because people would function better in teams than individually, typically in these countries. Try to involve as many people as possible in decision making, because most often this is allowed in a democratic culture. Now, there are some proposed indicators of power distance, and there are countries that are ranked nearest to 100, such as Russia and perhaps China, where the power distance is quite high. And then our countries with lower power distance, we can see that Germany and the Netherlands are ranking quite low. Next, we will have a look at individualism. Now, the characteristics of a country with high individualism would be as follows. People's time and freedom tend to be highly valued. They will enjoy challenges, they would expect rewards for hard work, and respect for privacy, for people's privacy, is also highly valued. And this we can clearly see in people's response over internet privacy issues. A few tips in dealing with these countries. Try to acknowledge the accomplishments of people and praise people if they accomplish something. Try not to ask for too much personal information from someone, and encourage debate and solicit people's opinion. In contrast, if we're looking at a country where individualism is low, we can see the following characteristics. There'll be emphasis on building skills and acquiring mastery. In other words, people will be more focused in a particular area. We'll find that harmony is more important than honesty. And when we're dealing with these cultures, it's advised to respect or show respect for age and wisdom. Try to suppress your feelings and emotions and try to work in harmony. And it's very important to respect traditions and to introduce any change slowly to organizations. There are proposed indicators for individualism around the world, with countries ranking nearest to 100 with very high individualism, and obviously countries ranking nearer to 0 with lower. In this case, it's proposed that the USA ranks the highest for individualism, and China, Indonesia and Western Africa would be ranking rather low. Now, next we're going to deal with masculinity. Let's have a look at the characteristics of a country where there is masculinity. Men are masculine and women are feminine. And there would be a clear distinction between the roles of men and women in the workplace. When dealing with a country that is quite masculine, try to be aware that male and female roles are expected to be distinct. You might not like it, but this is certainly the way it will be in that country. Try to also advise men to avoid discussing their emotions, especially if it's somebody who's a part of your team and you take them to that country with you. It's important that they be aware of the same. Now, looking at countries where there's low masculinity, the characteristics would be that women would tend to do any job that a man can do. And you can see that the moment you get off the plane, if you arrive at the airport, you'll see female bus drivers and so forth. You'll also find that powerful and successful women are more admired and respected in that country. Perhaps nowadays one of the first signs you can find is that there'll be a female president. Now, when dealing with a country that has got low masculinity, try to ensure that job design and practices are not discriminatory to either gender. There's not such a thing as a man's job or a woman's job in those countries. Be aware to practice equal gender treatment at all times. There are some indicators as to which countries rank high for masculinity and which countries rank low. We can see that Japan ranks the highest, whereas the Netherlands would rank the lowest on this list. Next, we're going to have a look at uncertainty avoidance. The characteristics of a country where there is high uncertainty avoidance. We'll find that people are very formal. There'll be loads of rules and policies in that country. There'll be a need and we'll be expected to follow structure. And there's very often a sense of nervousness, and they try their best to avoid differences. And when we're dealing with a country where uncertainty avoidance is high, we want to try to be clear and concise about our expectations. Well, there should be no ambiguity. We want to communicate often, frequently, in order to provide detailed plans. And we want to express our emotions through hand gestures and tones. So non-verbal communication would play an important role here. Now, looking at countries where uncertainty avoidance is low, we'll typically have the following characteristics. We'll find that there's a more laid-back and informal business attitude. We'll find that there's more concern over the long-term strategy than what's happening in the short term on a daily basis. If we're dealing with these countries where uncertainty avoidance is low, it's advisable not to impose any rules or any structure unless it's absolutely necessary, and try not to be emotional when responding to anything. Try to be rather calm. We can also see that there are some proposed indicators of where uncertainty avoidance is high or where it's at its lowest. It's proposed that Japan, Russia and France would have rather high uncertainty avoidance, whereas countries like or areas like Hong Kong and the US would have fairly low uncertainty avoidance. The last cultural orientation we'll deal with is long-term orientation. A country with a long-term orientation, where the long-term orientation is high, will typically find the following characteristics. Family would be the basis of society. We'll find that parents and men have more authority if we compare them to young people. And we'll find a strong work ethic. We'll also find that education and training is very important in that society. Now, if we deal with a country where there's long-term orientation, it is advisable that we always show respect for traditions. Try not to display or act in an extravagant manner. Reward people's perseverance. And try to show loyalty and commitment to the processes. Very important in such a culture is don't cause anybody to lose face. In other words, if you are going to say anything that would embarrass somebody else, even if you're right or wrong, try not to say it. Countries where long-term orientation is rather low will have the following characteristics. There'll be promotion of equality, there'll be high creativity and individualism, and self-actualization or achievement amongst people is sought. When we're dealing with a country where there's a low long-term orientation, it's advisable to follow the standards that we create. In other words, if we set any rules, we should follow them and we should lead by example. And it's also advisable to be respectful of others. It's proposed that China wins with 100 out of 100 on the long-term orientation ranking system, whereas Indonesia, Russia and Western Africa are ranking pretty low. Now that we have a thorough understanding of cross-cultural differences, we are ready to explore our next topic, which would be international business ethics.